The cold bit through everything. Through the torn greatcoat, through the layers of newspaper Viktor had stuffed inside his boots, through the fingerless gloves wrapped around the Mosin Nagant rifle. But the cold in his chest had nothing to do with the Stalingrad winter. Through the scope, a face appeared. Young. Too young. The German soldier couldn't have been more than 15. His helmet sat too large on his small head, tilting slightly to one side as he moved through the rubble of what used to be a tractor factory. The boy's hands shook as he gripped his carabiner 98K, and not from the cold. Viktor had seen that shake before. Fear. The kind that came with being thrust into hell before you'd even learned to shave. Viktor's finger rested on the trigger. Light. Familiar. 47 confirmed kills lay behind that finger. 47 men who would never return to their homes, their families, their lives. But they had been men. Soldiers. This was different. Kozlov. The whisper came from behind him. Sergeant Dmitri, his spotter, lay in the shadows of their hide. You have the shot. Viktor said nothing. His eye remained fixed to the scope. The boy stopped, crouching behind a section of collapsed wall. He was fumbling with something, a photograph. Even at this distance, Viktor could see the boy's lips moving. Prayer, perhaps, or a goodbye. 3 days ago, Viktor had been a different man. Not softer. There was no room for softness in Stalingrad, but he had possessed a clarity of purpose that now seemed to crumble like the buildings around him. Kill the invaders. Avenge the dead. Survive the dead. His mother. His sister. Little Anya, only 7 years old, who had collected buttons and laughed at his terrible jokes. They had been in the apartment when the Stuka dive bombers came. Viktor had been on patrol with his unit. When he returned, there was no apartment, no mother, no sister, just rubble and the smell of burning that never truly left his nostrils. The Germans had done that. Men like the one in his scope right now. Boys like the one in his scope right now. Kozlov. Dmitri's voice carried an edge now. Command wants that sector clear. Take the shot. Viktor's breathing slowed, falling into the rhythm every sniper knew. Inhale, exhale, hold. Between heartbeats, that's when you squeezed. That's when death traveled down the barrel and found its mark. Clean, efficient, just. But was it just? The boy in the scope moved again, tucking the photograph back inside his uniform. He stood, exposing himself fully. A perfect shot. Center mass. The wind was minimal. The distance maybe 200 meters. Viktor had made harder shots in worse conditions. His finger tightened on the trigger. 1 gram of pressure. That's all it would take. One small movement, and the boy would drop. Another name in Viktor's tally. Another widow somewhere in Germany. Another mother who would never know exactly where her son fell. What are you waiting for? Dmitri hissed. Viktor closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, he expected to see the boy still standing there, an easy target. Instead, the world exploded. The German artillery barrage came without warning, as it always did. The shells screamed overhead, slamming into buildings that somehow still had the audacity to stand. The boy in the scope threw himself flat, disappearing behind rubble. Viktor's position shook, dust and chunks of concrete raining down on him and Dmitri. Down! Dmitri pulled Viktor back from their firing position as a shell struck the building across the street. The impact sent a shockwave through the air that felt like being punched in the chest by a frozen fist. They pressed themselves against the floor, covering their heads as the world tried to tear itself apart. The barrage lasted 3 minutes. In Stalingrad, 3 minutes could feel like 3 hours. When the dust began to settle and the ringing in Viktor's ears subsided to a manageable roar, he crawled back to his position. Through the scope, he scanned the sector where the boy had been. Nothing. The boy was gone. Retreated, dead, or simply lost in the maze of destruction. Viktor couldn't tell. Damn it, Dmitri muttered. Lost him. Command won't be happy. Viktor said nothing. He felt something strange in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. Relief? Shame? He wasn't sure anymore. Come on, Dmitri said, checking his rifle. We need to relocate. The Fritzes will have our position marked from that barrage. We'll find another nest. Another target. Another target. Always another target. The war machine demanded feeding, and snipers were its most precise instruments. Viktor gathered his rifle, his ammunition, the few possessions that mattered in this frozen hell. They moved through the ruins like ghosts, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the open spaces where Soviet and German positions exchanged sporadic fire. Stalingrad had become a city of skeletons. Skeletal buildings, skeletal streets, skeletal men. Their new position was in what remained of an apartment building overlooking Red Square. The name was ironic now. There was nothing red about it except the blood that regularly stained its snow. Viktor set up his rifle, checking the sight alignment, while Dmitri studied the German lines through his binoculars. "Movement," Dmitri said. "Southeast, about 300 meters. Looks like a patrol." Viktor shifted his position, bringing his scope to bear. 4 German soldiers moved cautiously through the rubble. They were experienced. He could tell by the way they moved, covering each other, staying low. These weren't the boys they'd been sending lately. These were veterans. "Second from the left," Dmitri called out the target. "Officer, looks like. Probably a lieutenant." Viktor found him in the scope. Mid-30s, weathered face, eyes that constantly scanned the ruins. A professional soldier. A legitimate target. No moral ambiguity here. Viktor breathed, slowed his heart, found the space between beats. The shot echoed across Red Square. The officer dropped instantly, a clean hit. The other 3 Germans scattered, returning fire blindly toward the building. Their bullets pinged harmlessly against concrete 50 meters below Viktor's position. "Good shot," Dmitri said, already packing up. "But we move. Now." They relocated twice more before nightfall. 2 more kills, both clean, both soldiers who had chosen this war as much as anyone could choose war. By the time darkness fell completely, Viktor and Dmitri had found shelter in a basement that still had 3 walls and part of a roof. They sat in silence, chewing on frozen bread and what passed for rations. A small fire would have been suicide. Smoke would draw artillery or bombers. So they sat in the cold and the dark, listening to the distant sounds of war that never truly stopped in Stalingrad. "You hesitated today," Dmitri finally said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement. Viktor stared into the darkness. He was a child. He was a German. He was both. Dmitri was quiet for a moment. "We were all children once. The war doesn't care. Maybe it should. Maybe." Dmitri shifted, his equipment rustling in the darkness. "My son is 14, back in Moscow, if he's still alive. Haven't heard from my wife in 4 months. For all I know, the Germans bombed them too. For all I know, my boy is dead, or worse, drafted into some youth defense force, holding a rifle he can barely lift." Viktor hadn't known. They didn't talk about home much. Home was a fantasy, a dream that seemed more distant than the moon. "If my BA was in a German scope," Dmitri continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I would hope. I would pray that the man behind that rifle would see him as a child first and a soldier second. But if he didn't, I wouldn't blame him. This is war, Viktor. We don't get to choose who lives and dies based on age or innocence. We follow orders, we survive, and we hope that when it's over, there's something left of us worth saving." Viktor closed his eyes. Anya's face appeared in his mind, laughing at one of his jokes. She would be 9 now, if she had lived. Would she even recognize him? Would she see her brother, or would she see what he had become? A machine calibrated for death, counting kills like a factory counts production quotas. "Tomorrow," Dmitri said. "There will be more targets, more orders. The question isn't whether you can pull the trigger, Viktor. You've proved you can. The question is whether you can live with yourself if you don't." Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by nightmares that mixed Anya's face with the young German soldiers, until Viktor couldn't tell them apart. Dawn broke gray and cold. The sun, if it existed anymore behind the perpetual smoke and ash, was a theoretical concept. Viktor and Dmitri moved to a new position, this time in the skeletal remains of a church. The irony of dealing death from a house of God was not lost on Viktor. But in Stalingrad, irony was as common as rubble. They set up on the 2nd floor, where a partially collapsed wall provided excellent cover and sightlines across a major German approach route. Dmitri glassed the area, while Viktor checked his ammunition. 27 rounds left. Each one would count. "Contact," Dmitri said. "Convoy. Looks like they're trying to move supplies forward." Viktor looked through his scope. A German supply truck, moving slowly through the rubble, flanked by 6 infantry. Standard protection detail. The truck probably contained ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything the German forces needed to continue their assault. "The driver," Dmitri said. "Take out the driver, and the whole convoy stalls. Easy pickings for our artillery." Viktor centered the crosshairs on the driver's compartment. He could see the driver's profile, focused on navigating the treacherous terrain. Older man, maybe 40. Probably not a combat soldier, probably a conscripted driver, just trying to survive like everyone else. But that truck carried death for Soviet soldiers. Those supplies would extend German operations, would result in more Soviet casualties, would prolong this nightmare. Viktor fired. The truck swerved, crashed into rubble, and stopped. The infantry scattered, taking cover. Dmitri was already on the radio, calling in coordinates for artillery support. Within minutes, Soviet shells began falling on the stalled convoy. Viktor and Dmitri pulled back as German return fire started probing their position. 3 more relocations, 4 more confirmed kills. By the end of the second day, Viktor's count had risen to 51. The number felt heavier than the rifle in his hands. That night, in a new basement shelter, Viktor found something, buried under rubble, barely visible. A child's doll, hand-sewn, probably by a mother for a daughter. One button eye missing. Anya had a doll like that. He picked it up, brushing off the dust and ash. Somewhere in this city, a child had played with this. Somewhere in this city, that child was probably dead now. German, Soviet, it didn't matter. Dead was dead. "Viktor," Dmitri's voice pulled him back. "We have new orders." Viktor carefully placed the doll in his pack and turned to face his spotter. "High-value target," Dmitri said, reading from a message slip. "German sniper. They're calling him the Ghost. 12 confirmed kills of Soviet officers in the past week. Command wants him eliminated. Priority 1. A sniper hunting a sniper. The most dangerous game in Stalingrad. They have a probable location," Dmitri continued. "Northeast sector, near the Barricade factory. Someone spotted his muzzle flash yesterday evening. Could be a trap. Could be. But if it's really him, we can't let him operate freely. Every day he's active, more of our officers die." Viktor nodded. "When do we move?" "Pre-dawn. We'll have about an hour of good light before the usual chaos starts." They spent the night preparing, checking equipment, planning approach routes, discussing fallback positions. Fighting another sniper required different tactics. You weren't hunting a target, you were hunting a hunter who was also hunting you. The pre-dawn cold was worse than usual. Viktor's breath crystallized instantly, forcing him to breathe through his scarf to avoid creating visible vapor. They moved silently through the ruins, 2 shadows in a city of shadows. The Barricade factory had been the site of intense fighting. Bodies still lay where they had fallen, frozen in death. A grim reminder that Stalingrad took everyone eventually. Viktor and Dmitri found a position with good sight lines to the suspected German sniper hide. And then they waited. Sniper versus sniper was a game of patience. Hours could pass without movement. The first one to reveal their position usually died. Viktor scanned systematically, looking for anything out of place. A reflection off a scope, an unnatural shadow, the smallest movement in a city that should be still. 2 hours passed. The sun, hidden behind clouds and smoke, provided dim illumination that turned everything gray and lifeless. Then Viktor saw it, a barely perceptible shift in a pile of rubble 300 meters away. Not wind. There was no wind strong enough. Something had moved deliberately. He signaled Dmitri, who adjusted his observation angle. They watched together, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Then, for just a moment, Viktor caught the faint glint of glass, a scope catching what little light existed. "I see him," Viktor whispered. "Can you make the shot?" "Not yet. He's too well concealed. I need him to move." They waited. Every muscle in Viktor's body was tense, ready. This was the moment, the hunter and the hunted, both aware of each other's presence, both waiting for the other to make a mistake. The German sniper moved, just slightly, but enough. Viktor saw the profile of a helmet, the edge of a shoulder. He breathed out slowly, found the space between heartbeats. His finger began to tighten on the trigger. Then he saw the face. It was the boy, the young German soldier from 2 days ago, the one Viktor hadn't shot, the one the artillery barrage had saved. The boy had been given a rifle with a scope. They made him a sniper. The ghost wasn't a veteran. It was a child, turned into a killer by desperation and necessity. Viktor's finger froze on the trigger. The boy shifted slightly, and Viktor realized with cold certainty that the German scope was now pointing directly at their position. The boy had found them. Time slowed. Viktor could almost feel the German boy's finger on his own trigger. In that moment, Viktor understood that he and this boy were the same. Both killers, both trapped, both trying to survive in a world that had lost its mind. "Viktor," Dmitri whispered urgently, "he's got us. Take the shot. Now." The boy's scope glinted. Viktor knew what would come next. The boy would fire. Dmitri would die, or Viktor would die, or both, unless Viktor fired first. His finger tightened. His mind flashed to Anya, to his mother, to everyone the Germans had taken from him. Justice, revenge, duty. Then his mind flashed to the boy's photograph, to the prayer on his lips, to the fear in his young face. The boy fired. The bullet cracked past Viktor's head, missing by centimeters, burying itself in concrete behind him. A miss. Intentional or poor aim. Viktor couldn't tell. Viktor's finger completed its movement. The Mosin Nagant roared. Through the scope, Viktor saw the impact, but his aim had shifted. At the last microsecond, he had moved. The bullet struck the rubble next to the boy's position, close enough to send fragments of concrete spraying, close enough to be a clear message. The boy disappeared, pulling back into cover. "What the hell, Viktor?" Dmitri stared at him. "You had him. Clean shot." Viktor lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking, and not from the cold. "He missed," Viktor said quietly. "What? He had us. Clean shot. He missed, maybe on purpose. Or maybe he's just a poor shot. Maybe," Viktor began packing up his equipment. "Or maybe he's like us, just trying to survive." "Viktor, we can't—" "I know," Viktor cut him off. "I know what we can't do. I know the orders. I know the mission." He paused, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "But I also know that if we keep killing children, there won't be anything left worth fighting for when this is over." Dmitri was silent for a long moment, then he nodded slowly. "Command won't understand. Command isn't here." They relocated, moving through the ruins as Soviet and German forces exchanged artillery fire. The war continued, indifferent to the choices of two men. That night, as they sheltered in another basement, Dmitri spoke. 51 confirmed kills," he said. "That's your count." "Yes." "The boy doesn't count toward it?" "No." "Why?" Viktor pulled out the doll he had found. He studied it in the dim light. "Because if Anya were alive, she'd be ashamed of who I've become. But maybe if I can still choose mercy when it matters, there's something left of the man I was before this hell." Dmitri nodded slowly. "My son, 14 years old. I hope if he's holding a rifle somewhere, someone shows him the same mercy." "Me too, Dmitri. Me too." The war in Stalingrad would continue for weeks more. Viktor would add more names to his tally. The city would claim hundreds of thousands more lives. But in one frozen moment, in one choice made between heartbeats, 2 soldiers, one Soviet, one German, had chosen something other than death. It wouldn't end the war. It wouldn't bring back the dead. It wouldn't rebuild the ruined city. But it would let them sleep, and in Stalingrad, that was a victory more precious than any confirmed kill count.